So we were just talking about exposure and susceptibility. So it's important to note that airborne toxic substances generally cause more health problems than any other exposure. This is because the linings of the lungs very easily absorb toxic substances. An interesting fact is that if your drinking water is contaminated with something, usually drinking that water is not the worst part of your exposure. It's actually showering. When you shower, usually you are using warm water, and the way our showers work makes a lot of these substances vaporize into the air, and then we inhale them. So you take really long steamy showers and your water is contaminated, you're breathing that stuff in, and then your lungs are absorbing those toxic substances, and that is usually worse than actually drinking that water. Um, you can also, though, be exposed to toxic substances through food, water, and skin contact. And generally, the largest contaminant exposure will occur in industrial settings. So, if you are working with hazardous materials, that is likely to be where the dosage is the highest. So, you're getting the highest exposure to the most concentrated of certain chemicals, and that's going to be the biggest problem. So, it depends on what kind of job you have, obviously, be exposed to different types of contaminants. So, like with insecticides and herbicides, usually the people that are applying those are the ones that are most likely to have health problems from being exposed to those. It's less likely that those of us that might walk over a lawn that has these chemicals on them, that's not going to be as harmful as somebody that's actually applying them, and more likely to be exposed to much higher doses. It's also important to note that the condition of the organism and the timing of exposure also have a really important on how toxic they are to that organism. So, condition of the organism, if you already have other health problems, if your immune system is weak, if you're already sick, you're much more susceptible to toxic effects of different contaminants. Also, the timing of exposure is really important. So, at different stages in our lives, our vulnerability to these chemicals could be different. So, children and babies are generally more vulnerable than adults. Their children are growing and developing really quickly, they're growing brains. We don't want chemicals to interfere with those processes. Okay, so the next two things I need to talk about are bioaccumulation and biomagnification. If you took 212, you've probably already heard me talk about this. So bioaccumulation is the absorption and storage of environmental contaminants in tissues of an individual over time. So if I am drinking something out of plastic that has a chemical that's leaching into my water, or maybe I'm heating up my food in a plastic that has that chemical and I'm eating that, over time, if I keep doing that over and over and over again, I'm going to bioaccumulate that chemical in my tissues. Biomagnification is something that happens up the food web. So this is when the elevated concentrations of contaminants get higher and higher concentration up the food web. So let's say this shows DDT, which is a pesticide that was banned in the United States several decades ago. We have DDT concentration in the mud of 0.01. Small insects are continually filtering that mud and eating bacteria off of it. And you can see that their concentration is 0.41. So 400 or 40 times higher, sorry. And then we say fish are about 10 times higher because they're eating lots and lots of insects. And then the seagulls are eating lots of fish, and you can see their concentrations in their tissues are a little more than 10 times higher than that of the fish. So this is biomagnification. It's the higher concentration of contaminants as you go up the food chain. So the top predators are always going to be the ones in biomagnification that have the highest concentrations of these contaminants. Some examples are like DDT and mercury. So this is to explain it just a little bit better. So bioaccumulation is for an individual, not a community. Bioaccumulation just for the individual. So let's say this fish is eating phytoplankton. The X's are a pesticide, and this is the concentration in the phytoplankton. So the fish eats that, and it gets these 2 X's stored in its tissues. But the next day, it eats some more, and it stores 2 more. And then by day 3, they're eating some more and storing more. So over time, they're accumulating more of these. And this is more likely to occur in these contaminants that are fat soluble, because you're more likely to bioaccumulate these contaminants in your fat tissues. And this happens with fish, it happens with other predators, and it happens in people too. Biomagnification, as I said before, is what happens as you go up the food chain. So here we see, this example is PCBs, another fat-soluble contaminant, and we see phytoplankton has the lowest. As you go up to zooplankton, which are eating the phytoplankton, their concentration is higher. The little fish, the smelt, are eating the zooplankton, so their concentration is higher. The lake trout are eating the smelt, so the bigger fish are eating the smaller fish, so their concentration is even higher. And then if you look up here to herring gull eggs, so the herring gulls are going to have a higher concentration because they're eating all these lake trout, but they're using their fat stores to make their eggs, and so they're excreting this toxin into their eggs because they're mobilizing their fat to reproduce. And so the herring gull eggs have a really high concentration of 124 parts per million. And so you can see we started with the algae, the phytoplankton, at 0.025. But if you go to the top of the food chain, it's 124 parts per million. So that's a really big difference. And this is biomagnification because you're magnifying the concentration up the food chain. So again, animals are eating higher in the food chain, get bigger doses of toxins. It says toxins. Remember I said that's not the right word. PCB is a toxic substance, not a toxin. PCBs are not produced by plants or animals. This is from somebody else's version of the PowerPoint that got copied over by accident, and I missed this one when I was trying to fix it all. So anyways, some of these, when they get to be higher concentrations, can cause toxicity, where these other organisms lower on the food chain might have concentrations that aren't high enough to cause toxicity. So much more likely to get things like endocrine disruption up here in the top predator than down here in the plankton and the little fish. So I want you to know that biomagnification actually has an effect on your own life. So we see this occurring in our own food chain. And so the biggest place that this is a problem is when we eat fish, particularly fish that eat high on the, our high trophic level fish. So things like tuna, sharks, swordfish, tilefish, they have very high levels of mercury, which is a very dangerous neurotoxin, and 75% of human exposure comes from eating fish. There are about 45 states that have warnings about local fish, and pregnant women and children should limit their consumption even more than the general population. There are 300,000 to 600,000 children in the U.S. exposed to mercury in the womb every year, which can actually inhibit proper brain function. So really big problem because it's a neurotoxin. So a big place that people get exposed is by eating sushi. This red one is tuna. And it's important to note that there are some people in places like San Francisco where particularly affluent people that are able to afford to eat sushi multiple times a week. So they're going out for lunch or for dinner and eating sushi. And if they're eating these fish that have really high mercury levels, they're bioaccumulating mercury in their own tissues enough that they're getting mercury poisoning, and they're going to the doctor and they're like, what's wrong with me? And it turns out that they're being exposed to a dangerous heavy metal. Mercury is also a problem in Louisiana. Mercury contamination has led to fishing advisories in a lot of different bodies of water in Louisiana. This is also a problem potentially for people that are eating ducks that are living in these. So if you're a duck hunter, might be important to think about this as well. Dr. Manus has been doing research on heavy metal contamination in waterfowl in Louisiana from some of the local water bodies. And she's gotten duck hunters to donate some of the tissues from the ducks that they kill so that they can go through and test them for different heavy metals. So that's a really important research, but it's important to note, especially if you go fishing and eat your catch a lot, or go hunting, that ducks and fish can be contaminated with mercury in our state.